So I'd now like to invite Amy Stevens forward to discuss the intersection of heritage and human rights at Murujuga. Amy Stevens is the Heritage Research Manager at Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation. Amy is a Darug woman who began working in the Pilbara more than 20 years ago. She specialises in heritage management and the social justice outcomes of heritage practice. Amy has worked across Aboriginal heritage and social justice as an archaeologist, heritage manager, senior policy advisor and research director. Amy is currently managing the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation process for World Heritage nomination of the Murujuga Cultural Landscape. Amy will be participating in the panel as well, so any questions for Amy, please hold till the panel session. Welcome, Amy.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me. I first just wanted to acknowledge the beautiful Whadjuk country on which we're all standing today, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge the welcome this morning from Auntie Robin and Trice. But I'd also like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging for the country that I will be speaking about today. And thank the Murujuga Circle of Elders for their permission to talk about this deeply significant place. Just takes a second shot. For anybody who doesn't know, Murujuga is a collection of 44 islands, islets and rocky outcrops located in the northwest of Western Australia. It includes the Burrup Peninsula, which is formerly the Dampier Island, and the current nomination boundary is about 100,000 hectares of land and sea country that covers the Burrup and all of those islands. These days we have 5 traditional owner and custodial groups that come together to care for Murujuga: the Yaburara, Madadunia, Nalama, Yinjibundi and Wongatu groups. For those of you who have heard of Murujuga before, it is probably most famous for its rock art. We estimate that there are over 2 million petroglyphs across the landscape, and it's also nationally heritage listed for its stone structures, with over 3,000 already recorded based on a relatively limited amount of survey. However, the property is an almost continuous archaeological landscape. It's also well recognised within Australia for its extraordinary ecological diversity in terms of its topography and habitat, as well as its flora and fauna species in both a terrestrial and a maritime context. And it's extremely significant geologically as well for both its antiquity and its complexity, including the presence of some quite rare geological formations and processes. And the geology is in fact part of what contributes to the significance of the archaeology and the cultural record at Murujuga as well. It's an extremely hard and slow weathering granite and granophyre outcrop. And although it's very difficult to inscribe and requires a lot of time and effort to inscribe, it also means that the petroglyphs are very slow to erode. And so what we have is rock art that documents human interaction with this landscape over 50,000 years. But it's also a deeply storied landscape, with creation stories that account for the formation of the country itself, including the transformation of the landscape over time, such as the rising sea levels that gives the archipelago its current shape. So people have been living in this region for at least 50,000 years. However, this graphic shows how dramatically that landscape has changed over that period. It shows how the rising and falling sea levels have changed the coastline associated with Murujuga. You can see where Rosemary 8 and Ancient Pool is marked on that map is the current location of the Murujuga archipelago. And Murujuga has actually been an inland desert rangeland up to 160 kilometres from the coast for the vast majority of human occupation of this landscape. The first recorded contact, and then whoosh, all of a sudden, 5,000 years ago, it kind of starts to settle in its current configuration. First recorded contact with the rest of the world was via Dutch navigators and American whalers approximately 400 years ago. And it was in 1863, which is only 160 years ago, that the region was colonised and permanently settled by Europeans. So when we look at the duration of human interaction with this landscape, the significance of Murujuga has actually been perceived very differently for most of that time compared to the way archaeologists, geologists, ecologists and other scientists currently perceive its value. Cultural knowledge holders at Murujuga tell us that when the world was soft, the physical world was created here. Ancestral creation figures created the ocean. Creation spirits emerged, pulled up the land from the sea and lifted the sky. Our knowledge holders tell us that ancestral creation beings moved through this new barren landscape, interacting with other ancestral beings and creation spirits, and carved the earth into the hills, valleys, rivers, rocks, trees, and aquifers that exist today. Ancestral beings placed law in the country, accounting for the natural order of the world and how everything within it interacts. And it was during this creation time that the law for country and the resulting traditional law and business for people was inscribed into the stones at Murujuga so that it would never be lost. That law for people, that law and business, is still practiced by traditional owners and custodians for Murujuga. And it is how they have always managed country, according to this extraordinary complex understanding of the interactions between all aspects of the natural world, which includes people and animals and trees. And it's that complexity of knowledge passed on about how and why land is managed according to a complex natural order that has allowed such a dynamically changing environment to be managed according to the same law, even over periods of massive and significant change. So Ngardanali consider the Murujuga land and sea country to be a continuous cultural landscape. Beyond the tangible values that everybody can see, the landscape is a collection of ancestral dreaming tracks, songlines, spirits, ritual places, and ceremonial law grounds. It is a record of the very creation of the world and a record of how their ancestors lived and cared for that world over thousands of generations. And importantly, these intangible values are not always easily tied to specific geographical points in the landscape, which makes their management under existing heritage protections, including World Heritage protections, a little bit more complex. And it requires a comprehensive understanding of culture in order to assess the risk, the impact, and the appropriate management for those attributes that deserve protection. So the nomination of Murujuga has really focused on how we represent that story and the attributes that contribute towards outstanding universal value, and making sure that that statement of OUV is written in such a way that it captures the knowledge, the law, and critically decision-making that has managed this country over time, and the fundamental adaptability that is at the heart of law to ensure that it continues to respond to the changing needs of country. Because it's that continuity of connection and immersion within the landscape that is what makes this place truly exceptional. And that's a really challenging thing to represent within a World Heritage nomination process, which I've spoken about before, and some of you may have heard me speak about that before and my perspective on that. But of relevance to everybody who's working within the heritage sector more broadly, it's also extremely challenging to build into the ongoing identification, assessment and management of a cultural landscape, and even the individual attributes that make up that cultural landscape. Because when we look at the heart of UNDRIP, which Australia has endorsed, there are 4 key principles that underpin the articles within the declaration, most of which are not regulated at all within Australian legislative processes. And I may have actually skipped past my last slide. I did. And I draw your attention particularly to self-determination, participation in decision-making, and respect for culture and protection of culture. This is something that we really have no legislative protection for at all in Australia. And when we look at the articles within the Declaration, there are really specific rights that Indigenous people should have when it comes to the way we consider heritage, culture and landscapes. And that includes the right to maintain and protect things like sites and cultural traditions, but it also includes the right to maintain and strengthen their spiritual relationship with country, to protect country and to maintain, control and protect the development of their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. And this is not something that is managed well in Australia. It's not something that's managed well in Western Australia, where Aboriginal people have almost no role in decision making when it comes to the identification, assessment of significance and management of archaeological sites and cultural sites, where sites are required to meet a significant threshold to even be considered for protection. Decisions about the destruction of a site are made without the consent of traditional owners and custodians. Aboriginal people have no formal role in the assessment processes for major development decisions on their country, and there is no vehicle for considering the cultural significance of spiritual connection with country outside of a tangible geographic point at which a justification for significance can be made. And despite a lot of conversation in recent years about the inseparability of nature and culture and a very clear intention to see the Indigenous perspective that is inherent in that, the reality is that heritage protection mechanisms are still inherently focused on tangible values and the management of things. Even in places where there is a lot of conversation about intangible values, most of our legislative and protective instruments are still heavily focused on tying those values to a point in the landscape and asking Aboriginal people to identify the place that's most important for protection while they have no ability to protect the holistic landscape that they're actually responsible for. And this is really exacerbated when we look to demonstrate the management of a holistic landscape within the context of Australian state and Commonwealth departments that manage those elements separately. We have national parks that are managed one way and national heritage estates that are managed another. We have risk to natural values considered separately to risk to cultural values. And they are only ever assessments made by mainstream assessment instruments where the expertise of First Nation people who genuinely see the country and culture as a single unit is often completely overlooked. And that's certainly not to say that we cannot do this, because Aboriginal people in Australia are nothing if not experts at working within imperfect systems. But it does mean that a large part of the Murujuga nomination process has focused on how we embed expertise and self-determination in a complex patchwork of management that is actually going to protect Murujuga's future according to traditional owner and custodial expectations, and not just the myriad of experts that have their own perspectives on what is important at Murujuga. Because the reality is, if we don't find a way to address these issues, World Heritage can become a risk for Aboriginal people, more a risk than a benefit, especially at places like Murujuga, where traditional owners and custodians have managed to negotiate some joint management and limited role in decision making about that kind of management of country. World Heritage, if it doesn't protect what is significant to Aboriginal people, has the potential to impose a management regime that actually serves to undermine the role that they have in managing their country. The documentation and the compilation of a list of attributes that contribute to specific value under defined criteria, whilst being an understandably necessary part of a nomination process, provides a really unique risk within the context of a living cultural tradition that is at least in part defined by its adaptability to change. And at a worst case scenario, the identification of specific KPIs that monitor and manage value according to an international protective instrument can actually document a list of things that are important from an Aboriginal perspective and then provide a mechanism by which to take management away from Aboriginal people and put it back in the hands of experts and government regulators. The existing National Heritage Listing, for example, provides statutory protection primarily for the rock art and the stone arrangements, without any specific regard for the traditional law that gives it meaning. And what that does, essentially, is it places the weight of decision-making regarding impact and management in the hands of heritage professionals and regulators. It effectively perpetuates the systemic inequality that privileges white expertise over Indigenous expertise, which is not to undermine the role that subject matter experts have in supporting Aboriginal people to manage country, but it should not be conflated with subject matter expertise in regards to a cultural landscape, which has to lie with the people who are immersed in that deep and complex understanding of country. Because the last thing that we want to do is try and protect a list of places or practices or rituals that artificially preserves what cultural management looks like in this tiny snapshot of time and doesn't allow for that continued flexibility and adaptability in Aboriginal management of a landscape over the next 100 years, especially as we stand on the precipice of a changing climate and complex changing interactions between people and landscape. It is that dynamic management over 50,000 years of Ngunnawal occupation that we really want to protect going forward. All of which means that at Murujuga we had to move a significant step beyond the checkbox of free, prior and informed consent that is often the standard of First Nations engagement in any process. So at the very early stages of that process, MAC engaged their own in-house World Heritage Project lead to ensure that the partnership between traditional owners and the state was a genuine one. And we developed a process whereby the MAC Circle of Elders and Board of Directors were the decision makers regarding the content of the nomination and were the first stage of approvals required for every stage of the drafting process. And this is not something that would have been possible to undertake at Murujuga on a consultation basis. It required an Indigenous author with a similar perspective on the world to adequately represent the views of traditional owners and custodians throughout that process. And it was only through years of discussions and two-way learning that it was possible to end up with a dossier that meets the requirements of the operational guidelines and hopefully conveys the necessary content without compromising either the cultural sensitivity of the property or the value for which it may be recognised. And that included decisions not only about the content but about boundaries, the criteria under which we could pursue World Heritage listing, and the appropriate long-term management of values according to law. And given the challenges that we've already talked about in using existing legislation to embed Indigenous rights in the management of heritage processes, at the core of the nomination, what we have attempted to convey is the significance of Aboriginal knowledge, agency and decision-making as a critical attribute that contributes to the value of the property. Not only as an intangible value in and of itself, but an intangible aspect that gives meaning to a tangible list of attributes that makes the property as a whole extraordinary. And in a practical sense, that came with a cascading series of requirements to formalise the role of traditional owners and custodians in the management of the property. Because as we've said, this is not something that is done as a matter of course in Australian or Western Australian legislation. Although MAC elders and rangers and knowledge holders have always been involved in the management of the landscape, albeit in partnership since colonisation, that decision-making and that self-determination is not automatically embedded within management frameworks or the protective legislation of Australia. And so there's been years of negotiating formal joint management agreements, management plans, the return of country from industrial reserves to national park, and ongoing funding commitments for our rangers and our digital management systems to make sure that Aboriginal people are actually in a position to have a say in what happens on their country. All of which means that our process looked very different from the recommended sequence, which you can see on the left there. A very linear process that presumes a fundamental understanding of what you will end up with from the beginning. And that's not the reality of a process that prioritises genuine FPIC, agency and decision-making of Aboriginal people in an incredibly prescriptive and largely Eurocentric process. What it really looks like is continual checking in at every stage of the process to make sure that not only is this still what people want, but are we heading in the right direction for this to be of benefit to Aboriginal people by the time we get to the finish line. And what are all of the peripheral documents and negotiations and agreements and cultural management systems and tenure changes that need to be put into place in order to make this work? And although those years of negotiating best practice standards for Aboriginal involvement in landscape management and decision making have significantly improved the position of Ngunnawal compared to 5 years ago, the reality is that a genuine consideration of Aboriginal perspectives on heritage, significance and management does not exist. It will only really come to fruition subject to a successful inscription on the World Heritage List, exactly the way it's been nominated. The way the EPBC Act works to protect a World Heritage property is based on the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, which could be amended by either ICMOS in their recommendation to the committee or by the committee itself if an assessment considers that we've made a strong argument for one part of the nominated value and not another part. And in the case of Murujuga, genuine protection of Aboriginal agency and decision-making about what constitutes significance, risk and appropriate management of the cultural landscape requires a far more transparent process for approvals under the EPBC Act and direct consultation with traditional owners and custodians, rather than relying on assessments undertaken by heritage consultants and decisions about the suitability of assessments being made by government regulators. And of course, this is all largely theoretical and idealistic until we actually have a decision made regarding the World Heritage listing of the Murujuga Cultural Landscape. So there are a lot of caveats to the successful operation of a management system that recognises the rights of Indigenous people, even in a case like Murujuga's, where this has been a full-time consideration of an entire team of people working on this nomination for a really long time. Which leaves a lot of room for considering how we can better incorporate the rights of Indigenous people in relation to their own heritage outside of this particularly unique process. We are in a position where the Australian government essentially protects World Heritage properties on the basis of what is in the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value. And it puts World Heritage properties in a really unique perspective to be able to embed protective mechanisms or to protect values that need to be protected into that statement, which is an option that people outside of the World Heritage space don't have. But ultimately, although World Heritage listing doesn't bring increased protections in and of itself, and there is still a lot of work to be done to make sure that even with a successful listing that we can amend our existing processes and instruments to actually enforce Aboriginal decision-making in their own country. What it has done is it's provided Ngunnawal with a platform from which to negotiate improvements to the status quo. And it has always been the hope of our board and our circle of elders that a World Heritage listing that prioritises the perspectives and aspirations of Ngunnawal for their own country will set a benchmark by which we might see a way to embedding the rights of Indigenous people into the way we work across the heritage landscape.